Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review You Might Be the Killer. So, going into this film, immediately how I found it, but how you may not go into it. I went into the sci-fi app, sci-fi, SYFY, and stumbled upon this film, and then I was like, okay, like, I just want to see what the concept of this is. And all of a sudden I ended up going and watching a trailer of it, or just kind of like a quick review of it, and then I'm like, oh my god, I need to watch this film. There's something about it that's so concept wise so intriguing, and I need to now go and see what this is. And so I went into the movie, and here's two convenient ways you can be able to easily watch this for free, besides going into the Sci-Fi Network, because you'd have to unlock every bit of content in the Sci-Fi Network, which is probably going to be something you won't want to waste your time doing. So here's one app that you can dare, in fact, watch this movie guaranteed by going into Google Play. There is an app that I've been using fairly reliably called TV Crush. TV and Crush. So Crush with a C. You can go ahead and download this app and dare in fact watch You Might Be a Killer for absolutely free. You'll just have to hit the Watch Now button, and then eventually you can go through 3 different servers and eventually decide which movie you want to watch this server in, and you should be able to conveniently be able to watch this movie through that app, currently at the second it's recording. A second app that I've been using fairly reliably, but it may not be the easiest way to find. I've been using this app called Letter C Movies. So C Movies. So if you go into a Google search of things, you can search this app, and there, in fact, this app will pop up while you're searching, and you should be able to download this app, or you can go on the top of the screen and eventually also download Yes Movies and Shows, and you should be able to pretty much watch anything that you want, because this app seemingly has everything. New releases, like brand spanking new releases. You can basically watch a bunch of content for absolutely free that is basically seemingly impossible through the actual certain specific app itself. So how did I feel about You Might Be the Killer? So going into this movie, a lot of people might have the problem that they are to of not build this film. Like eventually they end up kind of quicking to the draw about a certain thing, and so a lot of people might kind of just be like, well, I wish that they would have built this film better, because it like ruins the movie once like they kind of have nothing to do past a certain point. But for me, I actually just really enjoy this film. Like, we end up having this goofy backstory of why this killer is killing people, and like the lore of this killer and why he is to be seemingly putting on this mask and consistently going after people. I really rather enjoyed it. Like, this movie kind of easily reminds me of movies like The Final Girls, not Final Girl, because kind of two slightly different things. But yeah, this movie has like a thing of like the Final Girls to me, and plus also they have to mention about the whole Final Girl thing. We end up having our main characters who are to be Sam, which a lot of people might recognize Sam from being in the movie Cabin in the Woods, the Chris Hemsworth film, Sigourney Weaver film, the Joss Whedon film, uh, where eventually kids are to go into the cabin in the woods and eventually decide how they are to die. Very interesting film. And Sam is actually the guy who ends up playing Sam in this film, Fran Kranz, is to be like the stoner character in that film, which is kind of funny seeing him here. We also have a girl named Chuck in this movie, which is actually played by Allison Hannigan, which a lot of people might, of course, know this lady, mostly by her being in, of course, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or quite possibly the uh, God, what there is some like magic show, like You Fooled Us or You Stumped Us. Like she's also in that. If you kind of like, and plus also How I Met Your Mother. Like a lot of people probably know Allison just from that. So, so yeah. So going on into this, what is the teeing up version of this movie? Well, even with the teeing up version of this movie, it may spoil the film because basically it like the teeing up version is basically saying what happens. Uh, like you basically have to say the spoiler of it in the even teeing up version of it. So if you don't want to know anything about this movie whatsoever and come in here blind, you might get a better way of watching this film, in all honesty. So you might want to click off now to eventually go and find this film, come back here and watch the rest of this review, or do whatever you want. So, the teeing up version of this, which is technically a spoiler because I have to, because it's like, it's kind of blatantly obvious. So, the teeing up version of this movie is that we have Sam, who is seemingly noticing a lot of his other camp uh, camp counselors dying off, and he is covered in blood. And so eventually Sam is to have a bat in hand and like trying to like hold some kind of defense, some kind of cabin, some kind of place to hold out to try and protect himself, while he ends up bizarrely going and excuse me, going and calling his, I guess, best friend or possible coworker, who I guess he had previously worked at this place, or is to just know the right person to ask about this whole situation. Because Chuck seemingly is to be either owning or working at this store that is to be of all kinds of like movie, comics, and all kinds of geeky kind of stuff. So we're kind of setting up Chuck to be this character who is the more knowledgeable character out of the two people. And so eventually Chuck is to try and kind of help Sam figure out where he is in the spectrum of this horror film that he is to be involved in. So eventually we end up finding out that eventually this killer is to be whoever is to be wearing this wooden carved mask. So this kind of very much reminds me of films like Plank Face immediately, but it also reminds me of like the Jim Carrey movie The Mask, of course. But really, this movie also is to heavily, of course, be just like Friday the 13th. You cannot not say that. But I think the way that they approach this is a little bit more interesting than Friday the 13th because they actually justify the mask. Like, it's not just some random thing that this killer ends up putting on. If anything, the whole mask bit is actually much more important than the rest of the outfit itself. Because the rest of the outfit is just some random thing that someone is eventually going to put on. But the whole thing about this mask is a seducer, so much so that people find this mask rigorously appealing to want to put it on. And so that's kind of the interesting factor about this film. So eventually Chuck is to walk Sam through where he is through the horror kind of thing. And eventually Chuck is to mention to Sam, it's like, well, so, like, probably out of all the other people, you're probably the person that is most covered in blood, correct? And Sam is like, well, yeah. And so Chuck is like, well, so what kind of like items do you have on you? Like what like specific things do you have uh and so Sam is to eventually have supposedly a bat in hand, but then eventually he ends up realizing that he doesn't actually have a bat in hand. He ends up having this kind of weird looking machete in his hand instead. And so that I guess he must have taken from the killer. And then eventually we also have Sam, who is to eventually be finding out that he has had a cluster of blackouts fairly recently. And Chuck is like, well, like, why are you having all these kinds of blackouts during this one specific time? That seems quite weird. And so then eventually Chuck is to come up with the answer for Sam of where exactly he is at by a quick portion of film to let him know, yeah, there's a possibility that you might be the killer. So with that said, let's go out of our way to go into that spoiler time. And let's get into spoilers about this movie. So spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this film. So Sam is, like I said, he ends up going and calling Chuck, who seems to be working at this this kind of barrage of kind of geek slash because we have this girl who is to have these like movie rows, and she has comic books and just kind of a mad cluster of all kind of like stuff that she could easily say that this person is going to be an expert of some kind. But she also has these random like books that are to kind of help her assess things also. So Sam, of course, is to try and give Chuck a call because Sam was to mention that he had tried to call the sheriff, but he only got his voicemail. And because, of course, like, why would you actually go and get this sheriff and, like, be able to contact him, have him make his way there, because he'll probably end up getting killed regardless. So eventually, Sam is to call the sheriff, get his voicemail, and the sheriff doesn't really answer his voicemail until like the very end, the very tail end of the movie. And even with that, like we just have the sheriff that is to really not even, I guess, have really checked his voicemail because the sheriff is just like, well, hey, like, Sam, I heard that you called. Like, if anything, I'm hoping things are going really well at that camp. If anything, I want to go and check things out because my daughter is to be at this camp. So, if anything, I'm going to go down there sometime soon and go and check on things. So, hopefully, everything's going okay. Like, that's the message that the sheriff ends up giving it towards the very tail end of this film. So, because evidently he didn't even listen to the voicemail saying that like, hey, people are dying here, help us out. So eventually, like I said, so Sam is to immediately tell us that a lot of counselors have been killed at this point. And so eventually we really start to kind of pull back and get like the early stages of the kills and just kind of the early stages of just Sam being at this camp and kind of the lead up till us eventually trying to figure out that Sam, you might be the killer. So uh, Sam eventually is to reflect on him getting to this camp and going through and giving all these camp counselors these shirts and eventually kind of running us through these names where we end up having, of course, Steve, the canoe king, and or the kayak king. And so uh, like it seems that Steve is kind of this like veteran kind of camp counselor where it seems that quite easily he is to be the most like experienced out of all these people. It seems like everyone else, like, this is probably their first year here. So uh, eventually Sam is to help us get to know certain characters, but eventually we'll probably forget who some of them are because they're quickly forgettable, in all brutal honesty. So uh, so eventually Sam is to eventually go and hang out with a girl named Amani. And it seems that Sam and Amani have had a previous relationship uh, before like this whole thing had happened. And so the following year of this camp, we end up showing that these two people are to have a relationship, to show in the much more current camp that both Sam and Amani had broken up during that stretch of time, and that uh, reasonably now Sam is still pining away for this girl because he forcibly has to. So to, I guess, probably give Sam some kind of motive for wanting to go and possibly kill a number of people. So now Sam is to walk us through the very first death of things. So the very first death, we end up finding Steve hung upside down and he had been brutally stabbed. And so it seems that Sam and the rest of the camp counselors are to all find Steve dead, and they're like, "Oh my god, this is awful." But the funny thing is that Steve isn't actually the very first kill. He is just the very first kill that everyone else is to find. So there seems to be a kill, like, it goes from killing two to us eventually finding out that there is more than just Steve, who had already been dead. So now let's even kind of like back up a little bit more. So Sam eventually is to go on into us telling us that Sam's family used or did uh, own this camp. And supposedly, I guess the reason why Sam's family had gotten this camp so cheap is because I guess there had been this horrific backstory that was to have been told about this camp, where eventually it seems that this camp had some backstory about like this being like some kind of ancient Indian burial ground kind of thing, and that eventually there had been this wood carver that seemingly had invested this camp afterwards. And so this wood carver ended up going and, of course, carving up this certain kind of mask, and then eventually decided, well, hey, like, I'm gonna go ahead and put this mask on after I've like carved it to see if it really fits my head pretty snug. And so all of a sudden, this wood carver is to put on this mask to all of a sudden go out and start to kill people, I guess, forcibly from out of his control. So it seemed that eventually this wood carver had been killed after this thrust of killing moment, and so he ended up getting buried somewhere nearby the camp. And so immediately we end up having the group who's like, oh my god, so we need to go and we need to find this guy's grave. And this is going to be like the scavenger hunt kind of thing to eventually find this guy's grave and hopefully be able to just kind of like find this mask to kind of prove that this story was actually true. So everybody ends up running off to eventually go and try to find this grave site. And so eventually Sam and this girl Drew are to, of course, go off and try to find this grave. And of course, they end up stumbling upon it. You can't really read what the grave easily says, but it looks like there's a gravestone there or a tombstone there. So eventually Drew is to kind of eventually just kind of dig into this grave to eventually find the mask there, and ends up going and holding on to it. And she's like, oh yeah, we found it. We did it. And so eventually Sam is like, well, hey, like I'm not 100% certain that this whole story is true or not or whatever, but like, do not put on that mask. And so Drew is like, oh no, I won't put on the mask. And so Drew instead ends up going and chucking this mask onto Sam, and then Sam ends up going and cutting the throat of Drew and killing her off. And then eventually he heads on to eventually go and kill Steve, hang him upside down, like slice his throat, hang him upside down, stab him a couple more times, and then all of a sudden Sam is to have eventually like taken the mask off, fallen over, and realized, oh my god, like Steve is now dead, like not realizing that he even did this because he blacked the whole thing out. But then eventually he all of a sudden has killer vision, where eventually he is to reflect on the fact that yes, he did do all these things, and yes, he is actually the killer. And so now we start to have the bodies starting to stack up, where Sam is to tell us how all of the other camp counselors are to be dead, and we purposely end up having a kill count being put together, and the kill count ends up having to bejokingly adjust for a number of reasons. So Sam is to be wielding this bone / machete, and eventually Sam is to go into his backpack to realize he now has this mask in his backpack. And because Chuck is to mention, it's like, well, all killers seem to have a mask, or otherwise they would have easily figured out that you are the killer. So, like, if anything, like, do you have a mask on you? And Sam is like, well, yeah, I guess I do. And so then eventually Sam is kind of forced or seduced into putting on this mask, because this mask is consistently whispering sweet nothings to him. Till eventually when Sam is to put on this mask, it sounds like Jason's Friday the 13th, where it's like, kill, 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 kill. like, so it always has a weird seduction voice or whatever that is to appease, to forcibly have Sam put this mask on. So the very next kills that are to happen seemingly after this is we end up having seemingly Sam going off, and there ends up being these two characters that instead of going off to go and find this mask, they both decide to go to this pool and decide to skinny dip. Because Sam is to not exactly remember where the mask burial was, but he does remember it's by some pool because he ended up blacking out during that point. But then eventually Sam is to remember that two people, which I think one of the people is to be a guy named Ted and quite possibly a girl named Alice, who or maybe I'm probably getting that incorrect because that's bound to happen. So these two people are to go and want to skinny dip, and so eventually Sam, as the killer, is to appear. Like I just really just eventually just want to call Sam, like when he's the killer, to just call him Plank Face because he's wearing a piece of wood on it. Like we could end up calling him like some kind of goofy name because they don't actually give him one. Um, like they could have called him like Lumber or so, I don't know, but they don't actually they don't give him a name, so now we're just forced to calling him Sam the killer. uh or we could call him the wood carver because that's basically like uh the character's kind of backstory. So we'll call him the wood carver whenever Sam is to have the mask on. So the wood carver is to, because technically he's carving through people and he's wearing a piece of wood on his face, so wood carver. So uh, the wood carver is to go and of course slice, I think, through the, like he mostly slices through a lot of people's throats in this movie for whatever reason. Very rarely he either goes through the stomach, but most of the time he slices through the neck most of the time. So uh, Sam, or the wood carver, goes and kills, of course, the one guy, and then grabs the girl and pushes her into the water and murders her. So then he, of course, unmasks again, and then, of course, is to just try to run off because several people are going to eventually be dead at this point. So eventually, we have Sam, who, of course, everyone is to realize that, of course, Steve is dead. And so now everyone is kind of suspicious of who the actual killer is. And so now everybody's kind of like on edge. And Sam goes off and is to just kind of bunker down by himself, eventually realizing he's the killer. And so now it seems that we have to figure out how certain other people had eventually died. And so there is a point where we have Fred, who is to actually be with some girl, and we have a guy named Bob, who is to also be with some girl. So let's get to the Bob scene. So Bob is to seemingly be with, I think, Carol, but I could be wrong about that. So I'm just gonna say, like, Bob is with some girl, and they both go off and decide to go and grab marshmallows because I think they're gonna go and make a fire to roast marshmallows because they don't care about really what's going on at all about the whole finding the mask thing. They just want to find food or to eventually figure out how they can kind of go and do some traditional camp things. So eventually, Sam is to stumble upon these two in this kitchen, and he ends up going and slicing through Bob, and then he ends up cutting the throat of the girl that he is to be with. So that just starts to compact the kills yet again. Eventually, Freddy and the girl that he's with, like, these kills don't like exactly seem all that creative. Eventually, at some point, because it's just stacking up bodies and stacking up kills. Like, we don't end up getting like every single kill has to have like the uniquest way to die. It's eventually just like, okay, how is it that these people are going to get on the screen to let us know that eventually they're going to get killed? So Freddy and the girl that he's with eventually go and, of course, get knifed as well and killed off. And so Sam, of course, is to reflect on this now being in killer vision and remembering all of this. So eventually the numbers really just dwindle down to there being one guy and two girls left. And because everyone else at this point is to end up dead after seemingly, yeah. So, and we end up having consistently certain people when Sam is called Chuck. Certain people in the Ring of Saturn store, or Rings of Saturn store that Chuck is to be in, at some point just start to eventually chime in hearing this story, and eventually at some point they're like, hey, he should just end up killing himself because like he's the killer, so like he should just off himself because it's the right thing to do, like to prevent him from killing others, like he should go and have to like forcibly kill himself. And then so Sam is like, well, I can't do that, like I just can't. So and like seemingly random people start to really chime in, and like Chuck is just so invested in this story that like she really doesn't care. Like at one point, like Chuck is to close up for the night, and this one girl is like, hey, like I'm still here. And so like Chuck is to eventually kind of push this girl out the door and lock the door, and so like so that way she can just be completely invested in the story, because like she's not really like helping much of anybody out in the store, like she doesn't care, she just wants to be thoroughly enthralled in this story. So I think it's kind of a very interesting film. So uh so eventually now Sam has to with the dwindling numbers left, uh Sam now has to mention or tell Chuck how Amani was to die. So supposedly Sam was to at some point with the number of people left, he eventually of course ended up getting so seduced by the mask, but he was trying to destroy the mask. He was trying to eventually kind of crush the mask, or eventually try and get rid of it somehow by basically just trying to like stomp on it or try to break it against some kind of piece of wood, or like some kind of like place that eventually would seem to, like, you would have thought that he would have taken like the knife to the mask, or you would have thought that he would have found like some kind of like thing or weapon or whatever to break the mask. Hence why then eventually Sam wouldn't always just have this machete on hand. So all of a sudden Sam is trying to break this mask, and all of a sudden Brad starts to go on and is to eventually just walk by, and Sam is now having to forcibly, because there's another person, there's another person present. Sam is now seduced by the mask to eventually put it on, and so now Sam is having this tug of war like matchup with not putting this mask on, and he's basically like thrusting himself away from the mask because it's so close to him wanting to just put the mask on. So eventually Sam is to be so heavily forced into putting this mask on, and so Sam goes off and is to go and find Brad, and eventually, of course, stab him and, of course, kill him off. And then now there is to be two girls remaining. And so Chuck is like, oh my God, like, you're going to die soon, Sam. And Chuck is like, wait, what? Or Sam is like, wait, what? Like, how is it that I'm going to die soon? And Chuck is like, well, the classic horror movie rule that eventually you're going to get to the final girl, and eventually you're going to get killed by her, because that's like, whether it's an accident or whatever, you're going to get killed by this girl. Like, whoever usually is the most pure and whichever, like, yeah, you're going to die by her. And so Sam is like, oh, great, well, Like, I was trying to avoid that, but I guess if it's unavoidable. So now Sam is to be with the two girls left, who are to be Jamie and who are to be Amani. And so now, like, Sam ends up choking out Amani, and we are to assume that she's actually dead. But Amani was actually playing, and so eventually now Amani and Jamie are to still seemingly be the last girls left, and so eventually Sam is to break down to these girls because he's talking to Chuck about this whole situation. And so Sam goes and spells it out to these girls that, hey, Jamie is going to be the final girl because she's the one that's the most pure and like she's the youngest and whichever. And so Monty just kind of takes offense to that and just be like, well, like, why can't I be the final girl? Like, technically, the final girl is the last one alive. Like, it's not like who's the most purest or whatever. So all of a sudden, Amani and Jamie are to run off because Sam is to be seduced by putting on the mask again. So he's telling both of these girls to run off so that way he doesn't go after them. And eventually he is to eventually have the mask on him, and he's like, yeah, like, get away from here, like, as far as you can, so that way I can't kill you, and so, like, this whole thing will be resolved so I won't have to die. So Amani and Jamie are going off on their own, and so now, since Amani is ticked off that she can't be the final girl, now all of a sudden we end up having both Amani and Jamie fighting it out for the title of the final girl. And so all of a sudden we end up having these two girls fighting it out. And so Jamie ends up taking Amani's head off with a shovel. And now forcibly Jamie is the final girl. And so now Sam is to eventually realize that Amani is dead, and Sam is like, oh my god, like, I am going to die now. This is going to happen. So eventually Sam is to talk with Jamie and just like, well, maybe there is an actual way out of this. Like, how about, because I weirdly have this mask in my backpack. How about I give this mask to you because you're the final girl and you have to survive anyways. I'll give this mask to you. Like, just don't let me look at it, or don't, like, let me, like, don't even, like, take it out of the backpack. Just bury it in back into the grave where this mask was originally found, and we'll be done with this. Because Sam eventually is to figure out where the grave eventually is, and so both Sam and Jamie are to go there. And so what ends up happening is Jamie is to eventually take the mask and go and dig a hole, and Sam is like, yeah, just go ahead and bury it, like, I can't look at you and I can't see what you're doing because, like, I'll be so seduced by the mask. So just go ahead and just bury this mask and let's all be done with this and we can just run off together and eventually find help. So what ends up happening is Jamie is now digging a hole and is going to put this mask in this hole, we are to naturally assume. But all of a sudden the mask is starting to whisper sweet nothings to Jamie, telling her to put this mask on. And so eventually Jamie is to succumb to the mask, and so Jamie ends up putting this mask on, and so she ends up having the machete blade, and she ends up stabbing Sam, supposedly killing him off, and then so Jamie is to run off with this mask, now eventually just being the killer of this movie. So it kind of does like a kind of swerve to make you naturally assume that this story is going to go a specific way, but this mask is too seductive to um, eventually not have it just continue to kind of swap killers by the end of this movie. So all of a sudden, that's when we end up getting the message from this sheriff. And so eventually Chuck ends up eventually not finding out exactly what had happened from uh, from this whole movie, how it absolutely broke down and whatever, to all of a sudden have it be seemingly X amount of years later, I guess 2 full years later, where eventually Sam is all of a sudden still alive, and he is otherwise calling Chuck to tell him, it's like, hey, so Sam, or so Chuck, like, I'm in another predicament. And that's all of a sudden where the movie is to uh, end off with it seeming like there's eventually going to seemingly be a sequel to this movie, because it seems that they were to kind of mention, oh yeah, we're going to do a sequel to this film, but there is no guarantees. Basically, like, they had to come up with some kind of interesting ending to eventually champion this movie from getting a sequel. But this movie was done in 2018, which immediately is going to tell us that there's probably not going to be a sequel lined up. Um, Unless conveniently this is to have eventually been a movie that like needs to build up money over time for whatever reason. But I really actually like the cast of this film. I think of eventually if this movie goes into like a Netflix or a Hulu or something like that, I think that this movie will eventually find a huge audience, because the story is kind of undeniably interesting. You have this like Jim Carrey mask scenario where people are seduced with this horror mask. And I think that that was the best idea or the best concept to eventually go through and have a movie through the killer's perspective. Like, very rarely do we have movies like that where it's like Tucker and Dale versus evil, where eventually Tucker and Dale are to seemingly be these hillbilly characters that seem to be the killers in a certain kind of perspective, but actually they're to be the nicest guys, and things are to accidentally happen. Kids are to accidentally die, uh, like right in front of them, and so all of these people are to be, are both Tucker and Dale are to be accused of being murderers, but actually they aren't. It's just that these kids are too stupid, and they accidentally end up killing all of themselves. To where eventually Tucker and Dale are like, "Hey, are these kids like desperately wanting to just off themselves? Because like these kids just desperately want to die for whatever reason." And so all of a sudden we end up having like the final girl like wanting to take sides of Tucker and Dale and just eventually go after the thread of the film. So yeah, like very rarely do we end up having to sympathize with the killer in a horror film. But I liked this movie. Like, I liked the concept of it. I liked the whole like Jim Carrey mask part of it, where you're to be really just seduced by this thing, and Sam doesn't want to kill people, but he is just so seduced by this wooden carved mask that he just decides that he is to have to be this killer. We even have at one point where Sam is to try to like thrust off this mask and pull it off, and to seemingly try and get some kind of control. And so yeah, so with that said, that's all that I wanted to say of You Might Be the Killer. Go ahead and check this movie out if you can, but otherwise, it's about time for me to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.